Hello. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about Edgar Allan Poe and about Gothic literature. First, we're going to be discussing Poe's biography, and next, we're going to be talking about the key characteristics of the Gothic. So, who is Edgar Allan Poe? Well, Edgar Allan Poe is an American author. He lived from 1809 to 1849, so he actually died pretty young. He died when he was 40. He worked professionally as an editor and as a short story writer, and he's a fairly contradictory figure because, on the one hand, his short life was beset by professional setbacks, poverty, depression, bad health, and drug and alcohol addiction. But on the other hand, he was a very well respected writer in his own time, and he's earned a crucial place in the history of American literature. In particular, he was one of the first writers who created a theory about the short story form. And in all, he wrote about 70 tales, so he was fairly prolific for given his lifespan. He also just stands at a kind of watershed moment within the history of the Gothic because he inherits and writes in the Gothic mode, which we're going to be discussing in a moment. And then from this mode, he creates stories that become precursors to two other genres that we see today in modern fiction. Those are the horror story and the detective story. So I want to focus a little bit of attention on how he uses the Gothic mode, because this is the mode that he uses when he's writing The Cask of Amontillado and The Fall of the House of Usher. And we're actually going to be studying this mode for the next few weeks in order to see how different authors invoke the conventions of the Gothic and utilize them for different purposes, whether it's social commentary, whether it's literary commentary, or whether it's both. So, The Cask of Amontillado and The Fall of the House of Usher are sort of classic Gothic tales. And for us, they provide a baseline for studying the Gothic. So, what exactly is the Gothic? Well, the Gothic is a mode of writing that develops in the mid 1700s. It reaches its heyday at the end of the 1700s and in the early 18th century. It remains a feature within literature through about the mid 1800s, and then it branches off in different ways. So we still see the Gothic today in films, but or other kinds of literature. We also see it present in the detective story and the horror story. Now, when we talk about a mode, we're talking about a set of conventions that authors can deploy in order to basically make their writing, sound more impactful. So in this sense, it's different from a genre. A genre is a category of literature. So typically things get placed within genres. Modes are a little bit more free form because an author can write within one genre but can actually deploy these Gothic conventions. So they can use it in a variety of different settings. They can use it in genres like novels. They can use it in films. They can use it in poetry. So it can weave between genres. So let's look at the setting of how Gothic literature develops. I'm going to pull up a timeline for you. And what you see at the top of the timeline is works that we're going to be reading or have read this semester that include but are not only Gothic but other works as well. And on the bottom are Gothic works that we won't be reading, but they're helping to contextualize your understanding of how Gothic literature develops. So how does it develop? Well, Gothic literature develops in the mid 1700s in Great Britain. And it develops with the publication of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in 1764. And it actually grows out of an aesthetic interest in the architecture and literature of the Middle Ages, that is, Gothic architecture. Gothic literature is in part thought to be a reaction against the realistic fiction that had developed within novels in the 1700s. So in part, it would be a reaction against works like, let's say, Evelina, or to a lesser degree, works like Phantomina. So it moves away from the realistic fiction tradition in some ways, even though we also see in Gothic a similar interest in exploring character psychology. So, whereas Evelina is interested in exploring real life situations in the context of her own contemporary moment in Great Britain, the Gothic tends to be characterized by historical and foreign settings. So, you'll see in 18th and 19th century Gothic a lot of stories that are set in, France, Germany, Italy, and that are set also in the Renaissance or the Middle Ages. And within those historic settings, Gothic literature is further set within kind of extreme moments within those historical periods. So, a favored time setting for Gothic would be, for instance, the Spanish Inquisition. Um, and within Gothic stories, no matter where it's set, there's a strong interest in architecture, and also just on kind of interior settings. So, it's not unusual to find Gothic stories set in interior settings like castles, dungeons, crypts, caverns, or graveyards, as well as just sort of like ruins. Um, and the plot itself of the Gothic is motivated by sort of mysterious, supernatural, or sometimes inexplicable forces. So it's not unusual to see in Gothic fiction elements like found manuscripts. Sometimes the found manuscript becomes the frame for the story, and the story itself is supposed to be a retelling of the manuscript. In addition, other features you might notice in Gothic would be things like, skeletons, ghosts, people rising from the dead, people being locked away, and people being buried alive. And part of that is because the Gothic is trying to explore darker emotions within the human psyche. So they will feature, things like villains that are motivated by just pure malevolence or an interest in violence, as well as revenge. And Gothic stories themselves oftentimes explore crimes like rape, incest, and even murder. And the purpose behind all of this is really to explore different darker emotions that human beings have, in particular emotions like fear or terror. And Gothic is interested in exploring it in two ways. One is the story is motivated around a character who is experiencing different emotions like fear or terror, but Gothic stories themselves are attempting to suspend the reader's disbelief so that the reader themselves also experiences the heightened emotions of fear and terror. So, as this suggests, this is a literature that's strongly interested in exploring human psychology. And there's three different terms that I want you to become familiar with because you're going to be seeing them a lot in the Gothic fiction that we're going to be reading. Those terms are fear, terror, and horror. Now, you probably know implicitly what they are, but I'd like to really spell out a definition so that you know precisely what each of these terms mean. So these terms, as this chart suggests, exist on a kind of sliding scale in terms of how extreme they are. At the bottom of the scale is fear. Now you're probably familiar with what fear is. It's that feeling of being on edge, or being afraid of something happening to you, or afraid of something occurring. Poe, in fact, actually is really interested in examining what fear feels like to the narrator. Excuse me. The next step up from that is the emotion of terror. And terror is a feeling of extreme fear or even fear and dread. And then the final and most extreme emotion that characters oftentimes feel, is horror. And horror is a feeling of terror, but it's also mixed with feelings of like repugnance, loathing, and strong physical aversion. So as you read Poe, I want you to identify how Poe uses these types of emotions through the elements of his tale, that is, through the Gothic elements, in particular through architecture, through atmosphere, and through appearances. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll look forward to discussing the Cask of Amontillado and the Fall of the House of Usher with you on the discussion board.